we got another email, Brian, and you sent me this. It was to the CornyDriveThru at gmail.com address, but from our friend Adam Smith in East Yorkshire, England, who does the great research. And where does he get these crazy toys? He's got like any historical event or, just evolution of wrestling. He's got the poop on the thing. And did you even read it, or did you just forward it to me? Do you have any idea what I'm even speaking of?
I glimpsed through it and I said, you know what, let me send it to Jim, because if we're going to do it on the air, let's do it on the air. But this guy has sent over a few things and seems like he really does his research and knows his stuff.
Well, yeah, this is 5 fucking pages or whatever that I printed out of this email, but we will not read chapter and verse the whole thing, but it got me started because we've been talking about it's pertaining to early television. Remember a couple weeks ago on one of the programs we talked about in Memphis, we found out in like 1949 when WMC went on the air, they were able to broadcast wrestling from across the street at the Ellis Auditorium because they actually ran extension cords across the fucking street. And the pioneer days and primitive days of television, and then the early network broadcasts. We've been talking about that on and off for ages and eons. Well, he's got all kinds of research that he's done. And Brad, I will hit you with a trivia question that I bet you will not know the answer to, because I didn't until I looked it up specifically. Do you know where the world's first TV station was located?
The world's first TV station?
Yes.
My first guess would have been New York, Manhattan, but if you're asking me the question, that probably wouldn't be it. Columbus, Ohio.
Well, no, and see, I don't know New York City metropolitan geography, so you could have been close, but the world's first TV station was inaugurated in 1928 at the General Electric facility in Schenectady, New York. Now, where is that?
That's, outside of New York. I wouldn't necessarily consider that.
But basically, it was they opened a TV station because they're inventing television. They had to have a TV station to try to broadcast television in order to fucking invent television, right? So that was for 1928.
They had electricity in Menlo Park for a reason.
Yeah, they had to be able to turn the lights on and see. And I knew this already because, I'm a TV nut anyway, and documentaries and everything. But actually, a lot of people talk about the beginning of television as 1948, because your book, Primetime
right.
Network TV listings or schedules, 1948 to present or whatever.
The schedule book, yeah.
That was when it exploded, when it ballooned exponentially. But there was actually television. World War II delayed commercial broadcast television in the United States and therefore in the world by probably 4 or 5 years, because a lot of the advancements they had made leading right up to the war, they had to put on hold because they had other fish to fry, and then came back and did the last, 2 or 3 years of finishing everything. But there were TV stations starting to go on the air, even during the war. And the first one, which was in Schenectady, is also the first one that recorded wrestling for television, according to Adam's research. WRGB TV, located on Washington Avenue in Schenectady, New York, recorded wrestling for television on December 18th, 1942. That was the first time in the United States, it says here, probably in the world. And when you think about it...
And by the way, that's by Albany. I just checked. I didn't even realize where it was.
Well, and I mean, General Electric happened to be their headquarters for television, at least, for that type of thing. It would have been wherever their, manufacturing place was, but it wasn't because of the population. Nobody had a television set at that point, especially, until after the war. but they were trying to figure out what can we do with this. And think about it. When you're trying to figure out whether you can broadcast any video signal or not successfully, you're not going to try to cover football or fucking baseball or basketball. Wrestling, we can stick it in a room with lights and it's there, 20 by 20 feet. So that was just, experimental. But
who was promoting it?
Well, there was it. It doesn't say here in this research that he sent whether it was even promoted or not, or whether they just said, hey, let's try to shoot wrestling as one of the things we're trying to shoot.
And the book I have, I believe that would really be the network era. Because what you're talking about, 1928, that's before there was a network system in place for, ABC, well, eventually ABC, but CBS, NBC, Dumont, ABC.
Right. Well, the network, this was 1942, was before the radio networks existed. And that's
Right.
why NBC and RCA Corporation were trying to lead the charge into television because they were going to branch off into NBC. But point being, at that point, they were broadcasting to nobody. And then at this point, then after the war, we've talked about the Chicago broadcasts. The first attempt at a regular broadcast of professional wrestling occurred in Chicago, July 1946. In association, WBKB, in association with the American Broadcasting Company, ABC, started showing the Wednesday night shows from the Rainbow Arena. They had tested it in July, and the resultant broadcast was deemed to be of sufficient quality to begin a regular broadcast. And the show was an instant hit with the viewing audience, such as it was at that point. We'll get to that in a minute. But so that's another reason Chicago was always mentioned and was always talked about in the television conversation. They were there from the absolute start for the, viewing public, for mass consumption.
And that was ABC.
And then in 1947, in St. Louis, they got regular television service on February 8th, 1947 with KSD Channel 5. It was owned by the Pulitzer Group that owned the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And it was announced that the debut broadcast for KSDTV on the 8th of February, 1947, would contain 15 minutes of sports interviews hosted by program director Harold Grams. Among those interviewed would be St. Louis Cardinals catcher Joe Gargiola and Wild Bill Longson. Longson would be demonstrating wrestling holds on Grams during the program. And everybody loved the segment. Longson demonstrated some arm holds before hoisting the host into the airplane spin. And the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that it seemed to many as if Longson was going to hurl Grams through the television screen and into the laps of the audience. But for our purposes, this appearance made Wild Bill Longson the very first professional wrestler ever to appear on television in the city of St. Louis.
Wow. Of all the wrestlers.
He was the guy.
Yeah. Wow.
And also,
how quickly do you think Fez turned off his TV set?
As a matter of fact, that station also did the first successful transmission of television pictures west of the Mississippi River. Took place on October 8th, 1946, when that station made a test recording of a parade and apparently aired it. Blah, blah, blah. But anyway, and one more thing here. We got to go all the way to the end because this is another discussion because there's so much information here. But Los Angeles, we won't even get into the start of the television era in LA because we'll do that at another time. This is also detailed, but Brian, do you remember, did Rock Rims, the book that he did on Southern California wrestling may have been where I read this or wherever the case, but remember there was a revolt amongst the Southern California wrestlers, late 40s, early 50s, because so many of the matches were being televised around the territory that the live gates were down and their payoffs were down and the promoters were keeping the money from the television. And there was efforts at strikes or talks of strikes. And I think the TV union people got involved or whatever, and the promoters had to kick something in. Do you remember where we might have read that, or do you know anything about that?
Well, I'm pretty sure Rock Rims would have covered that in his Southern California. He did a Northern California book and a Southern California book. If they're still available anywhere, I don't even know how you find it. Google.
I think every once in a while he finds 5 or 6 and he sends out an email. They're like, goddamn Fabergé eggs.
But he did great research, and I believe that would be where you read. I can't think of what other book you would have read that story in.
Well, but at any rate, the point was that they started. See, there's some element of truth in all of the old rules of thumb in wrestling that the modern era and generation sometimes scoffed at as, well, it wouldn't be the same today. There was a reason why that they were rules of thumb, because the shit that you didn't want to happen had happened before with negative result. Whether it be exposing the business in New York and the wrestling business in New York goes to the shits for 12 years, or in this case, the studio wrestling shows evolved as a ways for the promoters to use television as a tool of promotion to their live events where people had to buy tickets. But originally, when there was no studio wrestling per se, and we were, all in wrestling, we're figuring all this stuff out. They just showed matches. And in some places like Chicago, they were able to control it and make a boom out of it. And the matches all came from the smaller clubs, as they say. And you didn't get Thez and Rogers. I know it's out on YouTube now from the archives, but that was not the normal fare that you would get on TV, even in the network days, right? But where that you had put main events on television, it had killed live attendance at live gates, or where you showed the arena matches themselves. It really hurt live attendance at the live gates. That was a rule of thumb for a long time, which is why it developed that you didn't see main event matches on TV and you had studios to advertise the big shows. Listen to this statistic, Brian, and tell me what you think of it. Because remember a few weeks ago, and I think it was Adam's research, talking about how Los Angeles wrestling had been on its ass during the war and then had gotten hot again with the new talent and the new booker and was doing just land office business right as television got started. 1948, 49, widespread commercial TV. Well, the opposite happened a few years later. It says wrestling matches from the Grand Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles were not broadcast from 1949 until December 1952. This somewhat protected the Olympic from the box office downturn seen across Southern California. When broadcast resumed in December 1952, it immediately decimated the live gate. Comparing ticket sales and grosses shows the huge decline. Listen to this, Brian. Los Angeles Olympic Auditorium is what we're talking about, not any other towns or any other buildings. In 1952, they sold 221,979 tickets and grossed $311,966.
What is this based on what they filed with the State Athletic Commission? What is this based on?
Yes, okay. Yes. Well, this is the figures that they reported. Obviously, down to the penny, it has to be for the tax. But yeah, for 221,000 tickets sold $311,000 because tickets then 75 cents, dollar 25, whatever the fuck. 1953, 38,000 tickets sold and they grossed $36,000. It went from 221,000 tickets to 38,000.
Same amount
and
of dates?
$311,000 to 36,000.
How many dates difference?
Well, that's it. It was weekly. The Olympic Auditorium in those years was weekly. So they went from averaging, what is it, 221,000 divided by 54 to 5,000 people a week every show to fucking blah.
I'd like to know what Hollywood Legion was doing at the same period of time.
Well, and see, that's the thing is that they were doing all kinds of Ocean Beach Arena. I mean, it's a book story in itself, but in 1952, matches from Hollywood Legion Stadium broadcast on KTTV on Mondays, Long Beach, on Thursday evenings on KTLA, Ocean Park, KCLA Friday, workouts, KLAC on Sunday.
Some of those survive. We've seen some of those LA wrestling workouts, which are an interesting thing. There's commentary over guys like baby faces just working through moves with each other.
But that's, again, that's the thing is that there was so much on television and the boys' payoffs were getting smaller. And then they had to do deals where they would rotate. They wouldn't show every match from the Valley Gardens Arena every week. They'd only do it once a month. But they had the Wilmington Bowl, the Valley Gardens Arena, Ocean Park Arena, Southgate Arena. And in 1952, and this doesn't count, that was the year of the Gilmore Field show with Thez and Leone. So they were so hot because they were still showing the smaller town stuff, but they didn't show the Olympic. And when they started airing the Olympic too, it just completely burnt everything out. And what else do people need to pay to see?
Well, I think a lot of it too was the morphing of professional wrestling in different parts of the country, but specifically here in LA, to a television product. Not just an event being filmed and put on TV with commentators, and very often in LA, they had Dick Lane. The commentators were as big as the wrestlers in some places, especially in the early days. Jack Brickhouse, like the guys who did wrestling. But LA, if you think about like the boom, think about like the business in the early 60s. The Destroyer, Fred Blassie, eventually the stuff they did with Tolis and Blassie, it was all about the promos. It was not all about the promos, but the promos were a big part of it. The Destroyer's promos were a big part of it. And I think LA, as time went on, became a perfect wrestling television show. Eventually they had the studio show with Dick Lane. And then that went away and it just all became Gene LaBelle yelling on the mic at the Olympic.
And by the way, Dick Beyer, I found a clipping, some stuff I was researching from 1957 with a rookie or almost rookie, Dick Beyer, 6 years before he would set the all-time television rating record in Japan. He was working with Pat Malone. That's just classic to me, those generations crossing.
I just found the program. I'll say it now. I won't save it for guess the program. I have it over here somewhere. I think it's 1937, Dayton, Ohio, Eddie Malone. Is that him?
Yes, that's him. He may have been the light heavyweight champion of England at that point. That point, the closest Pat Malone had been to England was fucking Oklahoma at that juncture, but he was the light heavyweight champion of England much of 1937 was Eddie Malone. But point being, yes, there's these things as wrestling and television was starting to intersect and form the modern era of both. A lot of this shit, led to trial and error, and sometimes it helped business, and sometimes that's why some promoters until the late 50s said, we don't want that television. Sam Muchnick wouldn't do a television wrestling program in St. Louis, except for the 2-year period that a brewery actually sponsored it and footed the bill. And then they syndicated St. Louis wrestling on TV to like Carbondale, Illinois, and I think maybe somewhere near Evansville, whatever the fuck. But when the sponsor dropped out because they sold the brewery or whatever, he said, "No, we're not going to do any more TV unless somebody pays for the whole thing." So through most of the 1950s until Wrestling at the Chase started, they were doing those fucking houses in the Kiel Auditorium with newspaper publicity.
Do you know when
every place was different?
When did LA get their studio show? Because they had a studio wrestling show for a while.
Well, dadgummit, let me just check here with Adam, who knows all the answers. Oh my God, there's a lot of, it's so dark because it's raining today.
Because I wonder just how much success was attributed to the concept of studio wrestling nationwide.
I don't know that he is going into the era that the studio show would have appeared, because this is still all the early 50s and the television contracts and etc. So we'll have to revisit that.
You know, in the stuff out of Chicago, the Wrestling As You Like It, which eventually became Wrestling Life, but there's a period of time, geez, off the top of my head, maybe 50 into 51, where the big thing on the cover was Now with Television Listings. And it was focused towards wrestling fans who were also going to watch all the wrestling that they were advertising in these Chicago programs. Here are all the places you could watch it, and it was all about getting the television viewer, the early television viewer.
And it's so cool because they would also be kind enough to go through. They would list the television schedule for like the 3 or 4 channels that was in Chicago at the time. If Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, by day and time, the old TV listings that folks like us remember, you kids. But they would put the wrestling shows in bold so you knew when to watch the wrestling show.
That's right.
But it was a selling point because, again, for the kids, and we'll wrap this part of it up, and then we'll go to something that happened this week on TV that is a horse of a different color. The reason why, again, that 1948 is most often given as the start of television is because that's when the basic nighttime scheduling of network TV programs began, even though that was still confined to the Northeast. For the most part, there was no transcontinental coaxial cable in those days, and they had to ship film canisters on, planes or whatever for a day or two later on the West Coast. But people started buying televisions, and Milton Berle and the Texaco Star Theater, and everybody always says Gorgeous George, but the wrestling phenomenon in general are the things that were mostly given credit for between 1948 and 1950. I don't know, the kids can Google it, but television ownership in the United States increased more exponentially than almost any, I think faster than the internet did, faster than cell phones, faster than even the radio, any kind of modern technology, from being in virtually like single digit percentage of people's homes to being in fucking at least half of them, if not more. And so that was why everybody went wrestling crazy.
And a lot of the shows that were popping up were radio shows. Arthur Godfrey was big on radio before he was the biggest thing on television. And there were lots of serials, whether it was Ozzie and Harriet or whatever. Abbott and Costello. I mean, there were lots of things that went from radio. Amos and Andy. I mean, there were lots of
Jack
things.
Benny.
Yeah, there were lots of things, lots of people that were major radio hits. So when all of a sudden something or someone you've been listening to for a while has a weekly, or in some cases a daily television show, that's a big selling point.
And of course, they were simpler times back then, Brian.
Yeah, how big was the screen?
Hey,
right?
When I was a kid, and my father's mother, my grandmother on my father's side, had some kind of surgery. I don't know. I'm 3, 2, whatever, 3. I don't know, but she had to come stay for a while, right? While she recuperated. And they fixed her up her bed in her room and everything. And they had brought her TV from home. Now, this was, say, 1964, maybe, right? And this TV's at least 10 years old. So that means it's from the early 50s. I didn't have an appreciation for it at the time, but I remember just that it sat on the tabletop there and it looked cool and the rabbit ears. But the goddamn it was black and white, obviously. And the screen was like 12 inches. And I'm like, even then we had bigger TVs, right? But that's what they were doing. They were sitting there. That's another reason why football didn't just run away with the goddamn ratings like wrestling and boxing, because you're looking at black and white at a 12-inch screen of a shot of a fucking 100-yard goddamn field. What the fuck have you got there? Right? But they could actually
but Gorgeous George and his
wrestling.
sequins. But Gorgeous George and his sequins coming out there.
Yeah.
Popped off the screen.
And so that's what worked.